I am Melissa Hayes, and welcome to the Melissa Hayes Show. You've probably seen the headlines about California gas prices, maybe scrolled past them thinking it's just another story about expensive California. But what's unfolding right now is something fundamentally different from the usual price spikes we've seen before. This isn't about a temporary disruption or seasonal demand. According to projections I've been analyzing, California is heading toward gasoline prices that could exceed $8.40 per gallon by the end of this year, while the rest of the country is expected to pay less than $3. Let me say that again. California drivers could be paying nearly 3 times what drivers in Oklahoma or Texas are paying for the exact same commodity. How could this stay under the radar for so long? What aren't they telling us? Well, here's what's actually happening and why this matters far beyond just the inconvenience of expensive fill-ups. 2 major refineries are shutting down in California this year. The Phillips 66 facility in Los Angeles stopped petroleum production at the end of last year, and the Valero refinery in Benicia is scheduled to close in April. Together, these 2 facilities represent about 20% of California's total gasoline production capacity. That's not a small adjustment. That's removing 284,000 barrels per day of refining capacity from a state that consumes 1.4 million barrels per day. If you live in California, you've seen this firsthand. The state has been running a delicate balance between what it produces and what it consumes. After these closures, California's remaining refining capacity drops to 1.34 million barrels per day. You might not think about it this way, but for the first time in modern history, California will be producing less gasoline than it actually needs, even before accounting for the routine maintenance shutdowns that happen at refineries or unexpected outages. The state is moving from having a cushion, a surplus capacity that could absorb shocks, to operating in permanent deficit. Now, you're probably thinking, can't California just import more gasoline from other states or countries? And that's the part most people miss. California doesn't use regular gasoline. The state mandates a special fuel blend called CARBOB, which stands for California Reformulated Gasoline Blend Stock for oxygenate blending. This fuel was designed to meet California's strict air quality standards, and it's a good intention on paper. But here's the problem. Very few refineries outside of California are equipped to produce this specific blend. You can't just order CARBOB gasoline from a refinery in Texas or Louisiana the way Nevada or Arizona might. The infrastructure doesn't exist. What's interesting is how California became so dependent on this isolated system in the first place. Back in the 1980s, California was the 4th largest oil producer in the world. Think about that for a moment. California wasn't just self-sufficient, it was an energy powerhouse. In 1982, the state imported only about 6% of its oil, but between 1985 and 2023, in-state crude oil production fell by 69%. Today, California imports 64% of its crude from foreign sources, arriving by tanker ships because the state has no inbound pipelines for crude oil or refined products. California has effectively become what energy analysts call an energy island. And islands are vulnerable. They're exposed to shipping delays, port congestion, weather disruptions, and geopolitical events halfway around the world. When you're relying on tankers from foreign countries to deliver the crude oil that gets refined into the gasoline that powers your economy, you've introduced a lot of variables you can't control. So what does that mean for you? Let's walk through what happens when a state shifts from surplus to deficit in a critical commodity like gasoline. Imagine you're a commuter in Sacramento or Los Angeles, and you pull into your usual gas station in late 2026. According to Professor Michael Mishi at the University of Southern California, you could be looking at a price of $8.43 per gallon. If you're driving a typical sedan with a 15-gallon tank, that's $126 to fill up. And that's assuming stable global crude oil prices. If there's a disruption in the Middle East, a hurricane in the Gulf, or a geopolitical crisis that affects oil markets, California prices could push past $10 per gallon. These aren't sensational projections. These are estimates based on the structural deficit California is about to face, a deficit ranging from 6.6 million to 13.1 million gallons per day that will need to be filled by expensive and volatile imports. Here's where it gets even more complicated. While California is bracing for this supply crunch, the rest of the United States is heading in the opposite direction. The U.S. Energy Information Administration projects that the national average gasoline price will fall below $3 per gallon in 2026, the lowest since March 2021. This is driven by a sharp projected decline in global crude oil prices, with West Texas Intermediate crude forecast to fall to around $51 per barrel. So the irony here is striking. At a time when gasoline should be getting cheaper for everyone, California is engineering its own price shock. Why does this keep happening? To understand that, we need to look at the regulatory environment that has developed in California over the past few decades. California has some of the most aggressive climate policies in the country, and many of them are well-intentioned efforts to reduce emissions and transition to cleaner energy. But the unintended consequence has been the creation of what industry analysts describe as a hostile investment environment for refiners. New climate rules enacted in late 2024 were projected to add another 47 cents per gallon to the price of gasoline. State taxes and fees, including a roughly 61 cent per gallon excise tax, add approximately 1.47 to the cost of every gallon. When you're operating a refinery in California, you're dealing with higher costs, more regulations, more compliance requirements, and more uncertainty about future policy changes than you would face almost anywhere else in the country. And that's the pressure point here. If you're a company like Phillips 66 or Valero, and you're looking at your portfolio of refineries across the United States, California starts to look less and less attractive as a place to invest. The margins are tighter, the regulatory burden is heavier, and the political environment has been openly hostile to fossil fuel companies for years. So when these companies decide to shut down refineries, they're making a rational economic decision based on the incentives California has created. What I find most striking about this situation is the policy reversal that's happening right now. For years, Governor Gavin Newsom has been one of the most vocal critics of the oil industry. He's blamed oil companies for price gouging, called the climate crisis a fossil fuel crisis, and pushed aggressively for a transition away from fossil fuels. But faced with the very real prospect of $8 gasoline and the political disaster that would create, the administration has executed a remarkable pivot. In recent statements, Newsom has adopted a completely different tone. He recently said, "We are all the beneficiaries of oil and gas. No one's naive about that. It's always been about finding a just transition, a pragmatism in terms of that process. The administration is now actively negotiating to boost oil production in Kern County to help stabilize supply." Think about that shift. From "this climate crisis is a fossil fuel crisis" to "we are all beneficiaries of oil and gas" in the span of a few years. The California Energy Commission, which was granted new powers to combat what legislators called price gouging, has also changed course. After passing laws that gave the commission authority to set a maximum gross gasoline refining margin and penalize companies that exceed it, the commission staff have now formally recommended deprioritizing that authority for at least 5 years, until 2030. Their reasoning is telling. Imposing profit caps now could reduce capital investment in refinery maintenance, increase the risk of unplanned outages, and accelerate the exit of more refinery operators from the California market. In other words, the very tools designed to punish oil companies for high prices could make the supply crisis even worse. And that's where the pressure really shows up. The state is caught in what they're calling a mid-transition phase. Demand for gasoline remains substantial because electric vehicles still represent a relatively small share of cars on the road, and the infrastructure for alternatives isn't built out yet. But the policies designed to encourage that transition have created immediate economic pain for the people who still need gasoline to get to work, transport goods, and run their businesses. Let me give you a realistic scenario to illustrate the second-order effects most people aren't talking about. Imagine you're a small business owner running a landscaping company in the Central Valley. You've got trucks, equipment, employees who need to get to job sites across a large geographic area. When gasoline prices double, that's not just an inconvenience. That's a fundamental change to your cost structure. Do you raise prices and risk losing customers? Do you eat the cost and accept lower margins? Do you reduce service areas? Every one of those choices has downstream consequences for employment, for service availability, for the prices consumers pay for landscaping, for the viability of your business. Or consider the trucking and logistics industry. California's economy depends on moving goods from ports to distribution centers to stores across a massive state. When diesel prices rise in tandem with gasoline, which they're projected to do, that cost gets passed along in shipping fees. And shipping fees get embedded in the price of everything: groceries, electronics, furniture, clothing, building materials. So even if you don't drive much personally, even if you take public transit or work from home, you're still paying the California gasoline premium every time you buy something that was transported by truck. The impact extends beyond California's borders as well. Arizona and Nevada are heavily reliant on fuel supplied by California refineries. Nevada Governor Joe Lombardo has already established a statewide fuel resiliency committee to prepare for potential supply disruptions and price shocks. These neighboring states don't have the same regulatory environment California has, but they're going to bear some of the consequences because of geographic proximity and supply chain dependencies. In my view, what policymakers and residents may be underestimating is how quickly this could create a feedback loop. High gasoline prices accelerate the desire to leave California or discourage people from moving there. We've already seen significant outmigration from California in recent years, driven by high housing costs, high taxes, and cost of living concerns. If you add permanently higher transportation costs on top of that, you intensify the pressure. Businesses start looking at other states for expansion or relocation. Middle-class families who are already stretched thin start seriously considering moves to Nevada, Arizona, Texas, or other states where their dollars go further. And here's the contradiction that makes this so fascinating from a policy perspective. California continues to advance impressive clean energy goals for electricity generation. In 2023, the state was powered by 2/3 clean energy, and battery storage has increased by over 2,100% since the start of the Newsom administration. That's genuinely remarkable progress. But electricity represents only about 15% of the state's total energy consumption. The other 85% comes from transportation fuels, heating, industrial processes, and other uses that aren't easily electrified in the short term. So California has created a situation where it's making real progress on decarbonizing the electrical grid, but that progress doesn't solve the immediate crisis in liquid transportation fuels. The gap between the aspirational timeline for electrification and the reality of current infrastructure and consumer behavior has created this vulnerability. What's the most likely outcome here? Unless something changes significantly, California is heading toward a period of sustained high gasoline prices that will be painful for residents and economically disruptive for businesses. The 30% of gasoline demand that will need to be met by imports, according to California Energy Commission projections, will be expensive and volatile. International fuel markets respond to global events, and California will be more exposed to those fluctuations than states with robust domestic refining capacity. The state could attempt to accelerate permitting for new renewable fuel production facilities or conversion of existing refineries to produce alternative fuels. But those processes take years, and the refinery closures are happening now. California could also attempt to relax some of the unique fuel requirements that make carbobs so difficult to import, but that would require acknowledging that those environmental regulations have real economic trade-offs, and there's limited political appetite for that conversation. If this trend continues, I think we're likely to see continued policy pragmatism from the Newsom administration, more efforts to stabilize in-state oil production, and probably some emergency measures if prices spike as high as projected. But those are reactive responses to a crisis that was largely predictable, and, as many analysts are calling it, self-inflicted. The bigger question is whether this becomes a turning point in how California thinks about energy policy. For years, the dominant narrative has been that aggressive climate action is not only morally necessary, but economically beneficial, that California can lead the nation in clean energy while maintaining prosperity. And there's truth to that in certain sectors. But the gasoline crisis reveals the limits of that narrative when the transition timeline doesn't match the pace of infrastructure development and consumer adoption. Here's what seems broken to me: the lack of honest conversation about trade-offs. Every energy policy involves trade-offs between environmental goals, economic impacts, reliability, and affordability. California's political culture has often treated these trade-offs as false choices, as if with enough willpower and investment, you could have everything at once. But the reality is that shutting down refineries before you have adequate replacement capacity for transportation, fuels creates genuine hardship for ordinary people who don't have the option to immediately switch to electric vehicles or reduce their driving. What seems sustainable, on the other hand, is California's long-term trajectory toward electrification, if the state can manage the transition more carefully. The growth in battery storage, the expansion of charging infrastructure, the increasing affordability of electric vehicles, these are real trends that will eventually reduce demand for gasoline. But eventually is the key word. In the meantime, people still need to get to work, businesses still need to transport goods, and the economy still runs largely on liquid fuels. The part most people miss is that energy transitions are measured in decades, not years. California is trying to execute an energy transformation on a timeline that may be faster than the technology, infrastructure, and consumer behavior can support. And when you move faster than those fundamentals allow, you create disruptions and costs that fall disproportionately on working families and small businesses who have the least flexibility to adapt. There's also a national security dimension here that deserves more attention. As California becomes more dependent on foreign fuel imports, often from countries with higher emissions and weaker environmental oversight, the state is arguably undermining its own environmental goals while also creating strategic vulnerabilities. If a significant portion of California's fuel is arriving by tanker from foreign sources, that's a potential choke point in a crisis, whether that crisis is geopolitical, environmental, or economic. So where does this leave California as we move through 2026? The state is facing a gasoline supply crisis that appears likely to produce significant price increases, economic strain, and potential spillover effects on neighboring states. The policy response has shifted from confrontational to pragmatic, with the administration and state agencies trying to prevent the worst-case scenarios by pausing profit caps and encouraging in-state production. But these are damage control measures, not solutions to the underlying structural problem. If you're a California resident trying to plan for this, the most prudent approach is probably to assume that gasoline will be significantly more expensive in the coming years and to make decisions accordingly. That might mean accelerating plans to purchase an electric or hybrid vehicle if that's financially feasible. It might mean reconsidering commute patterns or living locations to reduce driving. For businesses, it might mean building those higher fuel costs into pricing and budgeting rather than treating them as temporary. And that's the part most people miss. This isn't a temporary spike that will resolve itself in a few months. This is a structural shift in California's energy landscape that will persist until either supply increases through new refining capacity or alternative fuels, or demand decreases through electrification and behavior change. Either of those adjustments will take years. What I'll be watching closely is whether this crisis sparks a broader reconsideration of California's approach to energy policy, or whether it gets managed as an isolated problem without addressing the underlying issues. The political pressure from high gasoline prices is intense, and there's a real risk of reactive policymaking that creates new problems while trying to solve immediate ones. I encourage you to think critically about what this situation reveals about the challenges of energy transitions, the importance of maintaining reliability even while pursuing environmental goals, and the ways policy decisions made years ago can create crises that emerge suddenly. Share your thoughts in the comments, especially if you're in California or one of the neighboring states that will be affected. Are you preparing for higher fuel costs? Have you already made changes to reduce your gasoline consumption? What do you think California should do differently? And if you'd like to get more analysis regarding this matter, more deep dives into California's economy, housing market, policy decisions, and the real-world impacts on residents and businesses, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. These are complex issues that deserve more than surface-level coverage, and I'll continue breaking down the data and connecting the dots that others miss. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.